I'm Jim McAdams. I'm the director of the Nanovic Institute, and we're really thrilled and pleased to see all of you here for what I'm sure will be a very engaging event. The title of today's debate is, I'm learning the new lingo, is EU Epic Fail. Now, we used to put it differently, but the word fail, I think, captures the issue, or epic fail,
Communication issue.
question mark. We have two great speakers or debaters who I'm going to introduce in just a moment. But first, a couple of remarks. First of all, I know that you're all wondering, where can you buy their books? Right outside. And there's even a chance that if you smile and vote for them later on, that they will sign the book. Secondly, you're probably wondering if this is some kind of setup because we have two Italians on the same panel. And so you might think, well, this will just be the Italian perspective. But the good news is, one of our Italians is actually English. And so you need to keep that in mind. I will, first of all, introduce our speakers. On the right, we have Marina Coloni. Marina's a Fulbright fellow, Fulbright professor at Notre Dame this spring. She's a visitor at the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, a very, very distinguished expert on the EU and all things European, as well as a political theorist who is known throughout the world. She's from the University of Milan and has very strong views on the subject of today's debate. Our second speaker, this will surprise some of you, he too has strong views, is Sebastian Rosado. Sebastian is a professor at the University of Notre Dame. He specializes in international relations theory, and he is the recent author of a book on Europe, a book that has some relevance to what he's going to say today. For those of you who know me, you will know that I study Leninism, and therefore I intend to adhere to the rules mercilessly today. And these are the rules. We will first begin with Sebastian, who will be entitled to an opening statement of 10 minutes. Then Marina will have an opening statement of 10 minutes. Sebastian will get a rebuttal of 3 minutes, Marina a rebuttal of 3 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions, later have concluding statements and a vote, which we will dispatch to the EU, where they are asking themselves the same question, epic fail. In case our two debaters have any questions, I'm going to point out to them that I may occasionally raise this sign, and we also have a fail-safe, which is Anthony sitting right here, who has the same sign. No, that's 60 seconds, 30, time expired. Sebastian is first.
Okay. Like all EU states, I'm going to violate the rules mercilessly, so... You can hold up the signs, but it's not going to make much of a difference. I want to start by thanking the Nanovic Institute. I'm going to thank them again at the end, but just for organizing this. But I want to give a special thanks to Malcolm Phelan, who's sitting right here in the front. Malcolm is the reason you're all here. He is a community organizer. And we know what happened to the last community organizer from the Midwest. He became president of the United States. So I'm being nice to Malcolm because I think it might happen to him. Okay, first question, what is the EU, right? What are we here to talk about? The EU is a set of institutions, which in real English is a set of rules of behavior, tells states what to do. And it's a special set of institutions, right? The Europeans have given up sovereignty. They've given up the right to make their own decisions to a central actor, the European Union. And it's an unprecedented event. And I'm excited about it, and you're here, you're excited about it. But let me tell you about something that happened to me earlier today. I went to get my hair cut at Armando's because Mike Dash told me I looked like a vagrant. So I went to get my hair cut, and Armando's son, you all know where Armando's is? It's just off campus. And Armando's son's cutting my hair. He's like, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm going to go to a debate." And he says, "Hey, Armando, the professor's going to do a big debate." And Armando said, "Yeah, what's it about?" He said, "It's about the European Union." And he said, "What's the European Union?" And I said, "Armando, it's a set of institutions where states have given up sovereignty to a supranational entity." And he stops cutting hair, right? And the guy underneath him, by the way, did not have much hair. And the scissors are poised, right? And the guy's looking nervous. And Armando stands there for about 20 seconds. He says to me, "You know, Lou Holtz was in here earlier today." Didn't care. But I care. Unprecedented event. And I'm starting now. That was the sort of warm-up. So how do we work out where it's headed? How do we know where it's going? What you need to do, in my opinion, is you need to come up with a theory of institutions, right? You need to know why states create institutions, why those institutions look the way they do, why they rise, why they fall. You need to answer those kinds of questions. And then you need to show that you've got a good theory, right? And how do you do that? You show that it explains the past, and you show that it explains the present, and then you use that theory to predict the future. Now, people who know me are already rolling their eyes, like, "Sebastian, you're always about theory," right? Well, the point is, why do I emphasize theory? Because we have no facts about the future, right? The future is unwritten. All we have is theories. All we have is our knowledge of why institutions go up and down, why they survive, why they fall apart. But we don't have facts. All we have is theories. And when you're thinking about the future, theory is God. And I know that I'm saying that at Notre Dame, and it's slightly controversial, but theory is God. And so the question is, what is my theory? And my theory is very simple. It says institutions reflect the balance of power. If you know the balance of power, you can explain why institutions are created. You can explain what they look like, why they're going to survive, why they're going to fall apart. And I think, this will not surprise you, given I wrote a book about it, I think this theory explains the European Union from 1945 to the present day. And I'm going to show you why I think that's true. And then I'm going to use the theory to predict the future. So let's go back in time. Start in 1945. Let's go 1945 to 1960. What's the balance of power? World War II ends. The Soviet Union is a big bad state in the middle of Europe. It's threatening all the other European states. It's by far the most powerful state in Europe. The United States of America has stepped in to protect the Europeans. But the United States is a fundamentally unreliable state. And we can discuss this later. But I can tell you that no one trusted the US to stay in the early Cold War. So the Europeans realized that they're going to have to defend themselves against the Soviet Union one day if the US leaves. And to do that, they need a lot of economic power, because economic power, as they discovered in World War II, is what makes the war machine run. You need a lot of economic power. And to produce a lot of economic power, you need a big, unified economy. So in the 1950s, they build it. They build a big unified market, and they add a fixed exchange rate mechanism to it to support it. They create an economic union. They also, by the way, think long and hard about political union and military union in those days, and they came up with something called the European Defense Community. They're so attached to sovereignty that they eventually kill the defense community, and they decide that NATO is going to protect them from the Soviets. But they don't trust the Americans, right? So what they do is they create something called the Western European Union, which is an embryonic military union that will sit below NATO, and if the Americans leave, it'll take its place. So they create an economic union, and they prepare an embryonic military union. It gets you to 1960. What happens to the rest of the Cold War, 1960 to 1990? The balance of power doesn't change, right? The Soviet Union is still big. The United States is still unreliable. Less unreliable than it was, but still fundamentally unreliable. And as a result of this nothing changing, you get no changes. You get no moves towards political union. You get no moves towards military union. The economic union, again, because nothing has changed, is maintained, and it evolves slightly. I'm not saying nothing happened at all, but there are no revolutionary changes. There's some evolution in the economic union. The unified market becomes a single market with the Single European Act of 1986, much trumpeted. You know, we're going on about how Jacques Delors was the second coming of Christ. It wasn't really that great a deal. It was an evolution of what had happened before. What about the fixed exchange rate system? It also progresses. It collapses in the early 70s. So they replace it with something called the snake. And then they replaced the snake with something called the snake in the tunnel. And I did not make these terms up. I mean, this is actually the terms they used. And the snake in the tunnel is replaced by the European monetary system. And by the end of the 80s, they're talking about a single currency, right? So it's slow evolution through the Cold War. 1991 to the present day. What's happened in the last 20 years? Well, the Soviet Union died in 1991. The balance of power is completely transformed. And so there's suddenly no need to even think about political union, right? Now, of course, you're all thinking to yourselves, well, Sebastian, what about the Constitution? Let me tell you a little bit about the Constitution. First, it failed. But most important, it wasn't a constitution, right? It was not an attempt at political union. It was a pig, and they put lipstick on it, and they called it a constitution. But it was a pig, right? So there's no political union, no attempts for political union. There's not even an attempt at military union. They create an alphabet soup of institutions, right? ESDP, ABC, XYZ, you know, it sort of head spins when you start thinking about them. But they're all military cooperation, right? None of them are unions. The states still run the show. The union does not run the show. So there's no political or military union. There's also, because the Soviet Union has died, no reason to preserve the economic union. Now, I'm not saying there's a reason to kill it, right? But there's no reason to preserve it. So the health of the EU over the last 20 years has depended on what happens with the economy. And the economy was going gangbusters in the 1990s. So they followed through on all their plans for monetary union that had begun during the Cold War. 2000 comes, and the goose stops laying golden eggs. The European economy starts falling apart, and the union therefore starts to fray very, very badly. And what you see is states acting based on national interests. They're no longer behaving as members of a union. I could go on and on about this, and please ask me the question, and I will. France and Germany start violating rules left, right, and center. Single market rules, single currency rules. They feud throughout the financial crisis, and they pursue purely national interests. The Greeks mess up, as you all know, and the Germans sort of start saying, we don't feel so European anymore, we feel German, we don't bail out the lazy Greeks. I did not say that, they said that. Things falling apart, right? It's fraying, and here we are today, and everybody says it's in trouble. So what about the future, right? Based on all this. There's no Soviet Union, so there's going to be no political union, there's going to be no military union. The dream of the United States of Europe is dead, right? You can write that I said that. Second, there's no Soviet Union, so there's no reason to keep this economic union going. So again, the health of the economy is going to decide what happens, right? The problem is the economy is going to get worse. All economists will tell you that for the economy to improve, what you need is deeper union or political union. And I'm here to tell you there's no Soviet Union, so there's going to be no deeper union, there's going to be no political union. So what does that mean? They're not going to fix the economy. More crises around the corner, more nationalistic behaviors around the corner, and the further fraying of the European Union, I believe, is inevitable. Now, I want to be very clear here. I'm not saying the Europeans are going to stop cooperating with each other. They'd be crazy not to. But they're going to do so as sovereign states. They're going to do so acting on their own national interests, not on EU interests. And when that happens, they may still call it a European Union. And I know they will, because they're deluding themselves. They'll call it a European Union, but the European Union as we know it now will be dead.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you very much for all colleagues who organized this event. So I have to play the role of, so to say, of who is not, does not agree with this thesis about the future of the European Union. I read the book, I found it very interesting, I learned a lot, and also in order to reinforce my idea that the European Union will survive in different forms, perhaps, but in any case, what we did will also remain. So I divided my intervention into parts. The first is referred to Rosato's selective approach and arguments. The second will be devoted to the celebration of the European Union. So, the book on Europe United is based on two axes. First is a theoretical statement that is international relations are based on the search for a balance of power among competing nation states. Second is based on historical reconstruction, that is the analysis of the formation and the establishment of the European community that is now called since 1992 a European Union, from 45 to 1947 is said in 3 chapters, and then only in the end, very quickly, it's covered from 57 to nowadays. That is in the early years of the Cold War and before the constitution, the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. The constitution of the European Community, the European Union, is taken as a case study able to make true the theory of the balance of power defined by the author as follows. States established centralized coalitions, be they communities or unions, when they confront overwhelming competitors and have both the means and opportunity to balance against them. Rosato's conclusions seem to be coherent according to his premises, a logical interference and a syllogism. The European Community Union was granted as an answer to Cold War because the European is very Aristotelic, because the Soviet Union has disappeared, and because of the capabilities of the European Union to fulfill some task, it will be inevitably fail, disappear. I think that premises, analysis, consequences, and conclusions, as described by Rosato, are too selective and reductive when compared with the complex history of the European Union, so that in the end they seem to be, the conclusion, counterintuitive in respect to what is going on in the European Union as a whole, and in the member states and the enlarging progress as a part. I think that the history of the EU cannot be explained recurring only to a deterministic rational choice approach and to a teleological philosophy of history based, where all events are developed and can be conceived as an instrumental consequence, I quote, of balance of powers politics. If we would be coherent with this approach, Rosato should also address the geopolitical question that also Carl Schmitt, in his book on the nomos of the earth, considered about the role of the United States as arbiter in European and world politics and the limits of the use of force in a new global order. He wrote it in the 50s. On the contrary, I think that recent political and institutional developments of the European Union have challenged Rosato's thesis about the priority of the power balance theory among nation states, as I will argue in following. Power in the EU is no longer a pure matter, I think, of confrontation between autonomous nation states, as it was in the 50s, which is at the basis of his book, because of the existence of overlapping organism and the existence, of the European Parliament, which since the Amsterdam Treaty and now with the Lisbon Treaty, has the legislative power in the co-decision with the Council of Ministers. As I'll try to argue, despite stops, troubles, backlashes, contradiction, and contrast, the European Union will continue to survive and to face the process of enlargement toward east, and mainly towards South Balkan, initiated after the fall of the Berlin Wall. While Rosado adopted a realistic perspective and only the viewpoint of the international relations as a matter of confrontation between sovereign nation states, I'll adopt an integrative perspective in the analysis of the future of the European Union. That is, I adopt a normative, pragmatic, and internal viewpoint, as also being a European citizen. Normative, the basic principle on which the European Union is based in terms of fundamental rights, dignity, freedom, equality, and they are binding for all present and future member states. For instance, in the European Union, we cannot have death penalty. It's prohibited. Second pragmatic issue, related to the meaning and also pragmatic meaning of the European citizenship with the Maastricht Treaty since 1992 and the concept benefits we had in terms of mobility. We feel the compatibility to be both a citizen of our own country of origin and European EU citizen. Third, internal. It is related to the functioning of the European Union organism, that is Council of Ministers, Parliament, European Commission, Court of Justice, Court of the Auditor, and so on. And today, for instance, the Court of Justice has stated that Italy, the law on illegal migrants is not compatible with communitarian law. So Italy has to reform the law on migration. But in this regard, I want to underline what is my position is not merely idealistic, but concretely based on the reality of what the European Union has become, not only at the institutional level. We don't understand what is going on if we understand the European Union also only in institutional terms, but at the level also of the daily life of ordinary people. Indeed, communitarian law is prior over the domestic one. EU directives have to be ratified by national parliaments with consequences over our life. The milk, for instance, the cost of the milk, the structure of the motorway, and so on. The power of the European Parliament is stronger than the domestic one, mainly in terms of promotion of social policies, but also in terms of research and in terms also of research and technology. My argument is that nowadays the European Union cannot be understood only along the line of a doctrine of the state based on power strategies. It has to be conceived, we talk also a state as imagining communities, I understand, in relation to immaterial goods, resources, that is expectations, projections, ideas, imaginaries, identities, that is in relation to a common culture. So, it's important also the meaning of culture, knowledge in Europe. Taking this consideration as a background, I think that a too narrow theory of the power balance has induced Rosado also to a limited reconstruction of the history of the European Union in the 50s, limiting the analysis on the one hand only to the axis France-West Germany, while on the other hand to a unequivocal contraposition between Europe and the Soviet Union. I think that this was a genealogical mistake, which brings to a unilateral conclusion. The Cold War assumption is only one aspect of the birth of the European Union. There are, in fact, I think, three interactive reasons which have determined the constitution of a first attempt for a unified Europe. First, after the World War II, the end of the European hegemony was evident, so that post-war European states, being both winners and losers, has to confront with the two emerging superpowers, not only the Soviet Union, but also the USA with its occupation troops, the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty in 1949, and war reparation and compensations. In Yalta, in 1945, UK, US, and Soviet Union, also a disagreement about between the representative Churchill and the others about the ratio of the division of resources and the exploitation of German industry. They foresaw $20 billion for Germany as war reparation. Second, there was a necessity to avoid possible new wars and to accommodate the relations between the states, which played different roles also in terms of armed resistance in World War II. The relations between France and Germany were one among many variants. Rosado mentions mainly this axis in his book, while other countries were very influential in the formation of the European community. Italy, for instance, Belgium, as I saw also consulting the archives at the European University Institute in Florence. Moreover, France and West Germany did not have the same amount of national sovereignty and freedom. Germany had, because of the Nazi past and the trial in Nuremberg, had to pay war debts, reparation, exploitation of its industry, and its borders were not clearly determined until 1961 with the Berlin Wall. This past has had consequences over decades. For instance, Germany could have, for the first time, armed soldiers in an international mission only recently with the intervention in Afghanistan. Within this geopolitical unstable national context, an European military force could not be organized, not mainly because of problems within the member states, but because also the presence of US troops in Europe. In Europe, there were about, I think, 450,000 soldiers with 483 military bases. Nowadays in Germany, and until 2013, in a unified Germany, there are still 55,000 American soldiers. Third, in order to understand the significance and consistency of the European Union ideas and desires, I think that should be mentioned also the idea of the free and prosperous Europe. This is mainly the case of anti-fascists during the World War II and the legacy of the resistance against Nazi-fascist totalitarianism. I think it is very important to mention, yes, the Ventotene Manifesto, which was a manifesto written by Altiero Spinelli, which will be a very influent man at the European Parliament and a federal movement, and Ernesto Rossi in 1941 while they were in confinement on the island of Ventotene. And this document is very important because it was the start of a federalist movement arguing that the crisis of Europe as it was determined by the competition between nation states. So I think that prediction about the failure of the European Union is more a selective prediction than a given reality.
Thank you, Maria. Sebastian, you have 3 minutes for a rebuttal.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there. I'll just go to this question of the federalist movement, this idea that Europeans feel as if they are citizens of Europe, not sort of members of nation states, and that they wanted to avoid wars. I mean, this is an argument that you hear a lot, that Europe was... The impetus for Europe was that Europe had fought these genocidal wars, and they call them civil wars today. They're called World War I and World War II at the time. And that they didn't want to go back to that past. And that the problem was nation states, and I'm being faulted for focusing on states. Because Europe's moved beyond that. It's a common culture, I think was one of the phrases that was used. When I look back at the evidence, I just didn't find any evidence this was true, and I just want to give you one example. This guy called Jean Monnet, and Jean Monnet is thought of as the father of the European Union. And if you read Jean Monnet's memoirs, he woke up one morning in the Swiss Alps, and he went for a little walk. And he thought how beautiful the Swiss Alps were, and he said to himself, I can't allow us to keep destroying ourselves. Right? It's just horrible. So he gets on the next train to Paris. He goes back to Paris and he creates a document that leads to the European Coal and Steel Community, which is the beginning of this whole thing. And that sort of encapsulates the story, right, of Europe. It's evolved this European culture, right? The Germans don't feel German only, they feel European as well. If you look at actually what happened, Jean Monnet rushed back to Paris and wrote a memorandum. It was a secret memorandum. It was published in 1970. And in the memorandum, he says, the Soviet Union is the most powerful state in Europe. We need to rehabilitate Germany to deal with them. And I don't like the Germans more than you do. But what we're going to try and do is create a union, and we're going to manage it jointly. so that the Germans can't get a leg up on us. I look at that and I think to myself, it's balance of power politics 101. Then you ask yourself, well, what was Jean Monnet up to? And I think what happened was, for him and for Schumann and for all these guys, they were good balance of power people, in my opinion. And they floated this idea, and suddenly it made them famous, right? And so they started lying in their memoirs, right, about what they were all about, right? You get the story about, you know, Adenauer, who was born sort of on the border between Germany and France. He didn't know if he felt French or German. He felt more European. Adenauer is a balance of power guy. Again, this is what I found in the internal documents. I may have been selective, but I don't think so. I went to enormous. I was asked this question once. I said, "How many of the documents did you read?" I said, "I read all of them," and that's my view. So I just kind of don't buy the sort of European culture point.
Marina.
Okay. As already said, I want to go with a celebration, celebrating the founding fathers. So, in fact, exactly 60 years ago, on 18th April 1951, the Treaty of the European Steel and Coal Community was signed in Paris. Since then, the European Union has increased in terms of members and founding treaties. And doing that, the member state has transferred part of their sovereignty and legislative authorities. But we saw always the increasing number of member states. 1973, 81, 86. Then, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, exactly, again here, 20 years ago, the European Union did not come to an end, but vice versa, it has lunged toward northeast, where the different states have found variegate motivation for joining the European Union. For instance, Slovenia, former Republic of Yugoslavia, Baltic republics, 3 republics who joined the European Union because of of nationalist reasons. Slovakia, different, who split from Czech in a very peaceful way. So what does it mean, what Rosado wrote? The key to understanding the EC's future is the collapse of the of the Soviet Union in 1991, which fundamentally alters the European power structure. But perhaps this is more a wish than a certainty. EU is becoming economic and technological competitive to the US with the merging of Asian countries, and I have also figures about the GDP, about the euro, the dollars, about also the investment in terms of services and so on. So vice versa, I argue that the freedom of the European Union consists precisely in the freedom from the political, economic, bipolar constraints of the Cold War. What could mean the following sentence in the light of what has happened? The collapse of the Soviet Union has deprived the EC of its fundamental purpose. What has happened is that in 1995 we had other countries join Union, Austria, Finland, Sweden. Then 2004 until 2007, 10, 12, okay, 2 islands, Malta and Cyprus, plus 10 post-socialist countries joined the European Union, and so on. So, and now we are increasing, we have candidates country and so on. So with new the rights, duty bounds, and I think that we are older than the Cold War. Cold War only lasts 45 years. We are 60 years old, and we are always coexist. We are 5 million people, 27 countries, and the European Union is neither a nation state or a confederation. It is an experiment. We don't know how it will be, but we'll continue it also to cooperate. So why, the question to Rosado, why did the EU enlarge after the end of the Cold War? And nowadays it is ready to become broader. Why in the 16 years any member left the European Union? Why new treaties are enlarging common task? And in the case also in the creation, you said in a very ironical way, but we have as a synchronized armed force Europe and the Treaty of Lisbon, which is really a constitution for Europe, where human rights are binding for all member states.
Thank you, Maria. Now, we have an opportunity now for questions from the floor, and as always, we'll begin with students. The questions will go to both debaters, who then have, it says here, 2 minutes each to respond.
But then in the end it will be a peaceful agreement, will not like a boxing, no.
But that will prove your point and not his. He would predict boxing, I think. Okay, so first question. It's hard to see out there.
I have a microphone.
Where?
I'm a student of life. So,
No. Sit down, Lindley.
Sit down.
do any of these other people want to
There's
raise their
gotta be
hand?
a
I'd be
student.
happy to have a student go.
Who is it?
Oh, we got a student
You
here.
got a student.
Oh, one that too.
Here, or here.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah. This is more so for Professor Rosado. You talked about how the EU may keep its name. There will be some maybe supranational institution that will be called the European Union, but it won't be as it is today. Could you explain then a bit more, what do you mean as far as it won't be the same institution? At what point do we understand that the EU becomes a shell organization and not like it is today? And I guess maybe if I can maybe ask a different question to your opponent, what do you think the evolution of the European Union may be? Because you admit it may change also. So I guess, again, we're talking about predictions here. What exactly is more specifics about what the European Union will functionally be the next 10 to 20 years?
Well, as I said at the beginning of the talk, what makes the EU, in my opinion, is that they've given up sovereignty, and you used the word supranational. The institution that will come in the next 10 years, I'm just going to throw that out there as a number, and when it doesn't happen, I'll just add 20 years onto it. But the institution that's going to emerge in 10 years is not going to be supranational. That's what's going to make it different to what's happened in the past. So what does that mean, like in practice? What would it look like? Well, right now they have an economic union. I expect the single market will end up something like a free trade area, right? I think the Europeans will understand that there's all these sort of directives and laws and regulations and all the rest of it, and they could get the same economic bang for their buck out of just having a free trade area with very few rules and, very importantly, getting their sovereignty back, right? Free trade areas are between sovereign states. And sovereignty, again, is the key here. That's what makes Europe different. I think they'll take it back. Single money, there's a plan that's just been floated by the French, right? The French want what they call an economic government for Europe. And you think to yourself, well, that sounds very supranational, right? Very sort of integration, union-like. Then you look at what the economic government is meant to do. The economic government is going to be run by France, right, and the other nation states. And where are they going to put it? They're going to put it on top of the independent central bank, which will no longer be an independent central bank, right? So, again, they'll continue to cooperate, right, but it's going to be a system run by the states, not run by the institutions. That's what I mean by it's going to change. And then at that point, yeah, you can call it a union, but it's not a union, right? It's a free trade area plus some bizarre state-managed economic basket of currencies, probably, what they had back in the 80s.
Yeah, I would say that it's very easy to answer to the question because the European Union has never been the same. So it's difficult to say, of course in 20 years will be different because it's an experiment. But the problem is that it's not a nation state. So we are in a post-Westphalian constellations where the nation states and the European welfare states in the three different, social model, North Europe, Mediterranean, Central Europe are in a crisis. So alone the nation states are not at all able to overcome crisis. If Italy wouldn't have adopted the euro, we'd be in a bankrupt. So we all have interest, just also economic interest to stay together. And then again, the European Union cannot be understood also in terms of institutions, but culture, but sense of belongings, mobility, students and the family, a lot of family from different countries. So I think that will be something different, but we have to increase what we already have. But said, I don't think that the model of the nation states that conceived after Westphalia and after the World War II two will survive because it's a huge crisis, and we thanks also the European Union if we could have economically also survived.
Thank you. We had a question down here. You.
I thank you. I want to kind of follow when you talked about the sense of belonging in the culture. Sebastian, you talked about how when you said you don't think the Europeans think of themselves as European, but you pointed to a bunch of guys that are probably dead at this point. What do you think when looking into the future? What do you think of the upcoming generations and whether or not they will start to think of themselves as European? I think it's reasonable to say that the current people that run the show think of themselves as French, think of themselves as German. But what do you think about the fact that you have the mobility and the mixing of cultures that's gone on in the last couple of decades? Do you think as new generations come in and take over, will the European Union drift towards a more European way of thinking as opposed to a nation-state way of thinking? And whether or not that'll be, so not as much the change of generation will keep the European Union together?
We've already had one change of generation, and these people do not think of themselves as European. They certainly talk the European talk, and again, they do that one of two reasons. They're deluding themselves, or they want to sort of appeal to some constituency. But what you have to look at when you're wondering if they feel European is look at what they've done, right? The financial crisis. Everybody was crying out. They said there could be nothing more European and sort of in the spirit of the community than a fund for the poor, right? This was the big plan. They wanted a fund for the poor. And the German foreign minister says, I think everybody should look after their own poor, right? You're like, it's not a very European thing to say, right? And then, you look at the Germans now. Why is Angela Merkel making such a stink about the Greeks and, the Portuguese and Spanish and next? Why is she making such a stink? Because the people who are voting for her have had enough, right? They are German, and they are sick and tired of bailing out all these losers, right? That's how they think. Again, I'm one of those losers. I mean, I can't. But that's how they think. This is why she's so hard on the other states. So I just don't see, when you look at actions, it just doesn't look very European. By the way, this was very interesting. The German interior minister was interviewed recently, and he said, you know what? Germany is now pursuing its national interest with vigor, right? He said, we used to be the paymaster of Europe, we're now pursuing our national interest. And you weren't around in the Cold War, but the idea that Germans are saying that, right, is terrifying.
Particularly if you're English.
Particularly if you're English.
To think about national egoism. It's true that two referendums failed in the Netherlands and in France because, and so the constitution, we couldn't have a European constitution, but it was because the politicians used the argument of the European Union just to motivate the internal crisis, so that they voted against. And nowadays also Sarkozy is using, in order to have from his side the right-wing voters also anti-European argument, but mainly for electoral purposes. Regarding what you said about generation, it's very crucial what in European is happening. We treated also in a previous meeting on the future of European universities. That is that we have programs, 3 years programs, and the last one we had 20 billion euros devoted to the ERA. ERA means European Research Area for research. So that we have to apply for a project with at least 4 different teams from different national countries, and we have also teaching mobility not at the university, not only for students and faculty, but also people working in administration. And because we have different meaning of resources, not only material resources, but we have also to develop human capabilities, and so science development and so on. So is next generation is also in this thing.
Now we'll go to Professor Lindley.
Who is that?
I have a theory about European politics. It doesn't start
What's the
in
name?
1945. It starts hundreds of years ago. even Britain, they all started as principalities. So if you look over the 100-year span of European history, they're actually really good at consolidation and agglomeration. So I don't know why people are stopping here with the nation state when the EU can go further. Why did states agglomerate and consolidate? In part because of conflict, in part to become more competitive in conflict, but also to be more economically competitive. And this sense of economic competition, bringing together, consolidating states, is part of the motivation for the EU. And I don't see why that's going anywhere in a country, in a world where China's rising, India's rising, Brazil is rising. The EU has plenty of motivation to maintain efficiency by consolidation. So the question is, how much efficiency has it gained by consolidating?
Dan, I don't want to lecture you on state formation. It's clearly literature you're not familiar with, but the literature on state formation is that what causes states to form is external threat, right? Charles Tilly's famous phrase, right? War made the state made war, right? And my theory of the European Union is actually very close to that, right? For good reason. I think Charles Tilly is a genius. So I just copied his ideas and took them into international relations. But the point is, that's his argument is states form because of external threat, but a military threat. And that's my argument about Europe. But that threat is gone. There is not a lot of state formation literature that says that these things are driven purely by economics. Economics for sure has something to do with it. But, again, you're talking about giving up sovereignty. States love sovereignty, right? George Bush, not my favorite guy, but he got up there in that debate with Al Gore, and Al Gore said, I think we should go to the United Nations, right? And George Bush said, I'm not going to allow the international community to tell the United States what to do. He won the election, right? And that's how states feel, right? Didn't want anyone to tell them what to do. And so the only time you'd give up sovereignty and create a union is when you think you're going to die, right? There's nothing above sovereignty in the rank ordering of things you like. So it's external threat, and that's gone.
Perhaps you would like to know something about the EU budget in 2011. It's about 42 billion Europe, and the majority, 46%, is devoted to sustainable growth, jobs, competitiveness, and regional developments, because in Europe we have also ad hoc programs for underdeveloped regions, while 41% is devoted to natural resources, agriculture, and environment. And citizenship, freedom, security, and justice, just 1%, while for external development, global players, 6%. So if you look at the budget, it's clear what are the aims also of the European Union in terms of sustainable growth and regional development, so that there is not imbalance also within Europe. I don't know whether you may be interested in it, just to look the differences, perhaps also in comparison with the US, also GDP.
Thank you. Let's see if we can get another student here. Before I turn to Professor Desch, we're going to get competing IR theories flying around the room. And we all know how dangerous that is. Professor Desch. Oh, a student.
We've been
good.
saved by a student.
Yes.
I think in general, when you think about an institution in terms of integration, you have to look at three things. You have to look at three levels: political, economic, and military. And you spent a lot of time discussing economic integration, but we're not seeing any significant political and military integration. And to an extent, if we're thinking about the future, wouldn't that suggest that this is generally just an economic cooperation organization, rather something that is substantially a supranational, national organization?
we'll start.
And I know Sebastian's
we-
answer to this, so,
But
yes.
so we'll
No,
start
I
here.
think that about economy, I wanted just to say, integrating this argument, is that we have to talk also about the issue of culture and citizenship and so on. About economy, we did a lot, of course. I didn't mention because there is also, as said, looking at the budget and also what is the perspective for the growth, it's clear. And also if you have the statistic here about the beating inflations, about the euro, you can see how the euro is going down, I mean, also in terms of competitiveness with the dollars. About political, we have a constitution. The Lisbon Treaty is a constitution for Europe with human rights, with a perspective. About military, it's all to, we have started, we couldn't do it nowadays, but it's, I mean, it's foreseen, also as said, also an institution which has to do with the synchronized armed forces Europe. It's all new, but I mean, we have with the Lisbon Treaty a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Is British, she is British, and so we also started also this kind also of external, international affairs, and also the EU is present with the voting also at the UN level. So, I mean, it's quite consistent now also in terms of international, agenda. But what I was saying is that the European Union without culture, without education, without social policies in terms of security, in terms of pensions, in terms of also this kind of benefits couldn't be really understood. And why is the motivation? Why 500 people in 27 nations are together and any state split after the, having enjoyed the European University, European Union.
Sebastian.
Oh, it's a brilliant question. Let me take you back to the 1990s. In the 1990s, everybody thought that a United States of Europe was coming. The number of books that I've had to read and endure about the coming European superpower, the United States of Europe, Europe is the future. Several forests have been sacrificed to write those books. So there was this belief in the 90s that it was coming. And some very smart people made those arguments. Romano Prodi, who was once the president of the European Commission, said that the euro was the antipasto of political union. So he thought it was coming. Sam Huntington, who was, unfortunately, he passed away, but he's a super smart guy. Sam Huntington thought that there was going to be a military union. He wrote about it in Foreign Affairs. He did it mainly because he believed the French, who, love going on about how much they hate the United States of America, and therefore, how they're going to deal with the hyperpuissance, right? They're going to build, right, a European military. So all these big plans, and you don't hear any of those plans now. None, right? They're all gone. So then you got to ask yourself, well, what happened? What I think happened is the 1990s was a mirage, right? Cold War ended, everybody's very excited, right? Again, the economy's going gangbusters, so the symbol of the European Union is still moving along. And so they think it's all going to be wonderful. They were just dead wrong because they don't understand the balance of power.
May I just to integrate? Yeah, the problem is not now also the military issue, but is the policies of frontiers, of borders, because we have the problem of migration, and but we do not have yet a communitarian law on migration. And what's happened in Italy also with 30,000 people from Africa coming from in 2 months, it's a big problem. So we have to deal now mainly with the issue of frontiers and borders, because the European borders are the most dangerous in the world. I mean, because we have the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and many people trying to come to Europe die.
Thank you. A student? Oh, we're getting students. Sorry, Professor Dash. Yeah.
So I'll start my statement by saying, as I have to, that these statements in no way reflect the view of the United States Armed Forces.
Or the fact that you're his student.
Anyway, my question is, I recently took a course on European enlargement, Eastern enlargement, and I think that now the Germans are sort of getting tired of apologizing for the Reich with Deutschmarks and euros. So what do you think the Eastern European problem, those countries coming, their oppression and lack of development wasn't really Germany's deal at all, or the French at all. So what do you think that their addition into the EU has done to change the viewpoint of the rich countries towards bailing out the poor countries?
Do you want to go first on that?
I didn't really get your point. I mean, do you mean the Eastern European country, the post-socialist countries? I mean, plus the two islands, Malta and Cyprus, or the new, who also Croatia, like Croatia, but also Turkey, who want to, which want to, what do I refer to the present or the candidates?
Like the Slovakia, Slovenia, Hungary.
You mean the post-socialist countries? Yeah, the present, I mean, member state of the European Union. I mean, Estonia is the inventor of Skype, you know. Estonia was the basis where there were military bases, and it was, okay, they are 2 million people, but they invented, they transferred their knowledge in military industry just in high technology. And also Slovakia tried to develop we have a representative of Slovakia, so we can also say what does it mean to be a new state and at the same time a European state. The same was for Slovenia, and they are doing quite well. I mean, also because for the Baltic region they were scaring about Russia, so they are becoming very, very much European also because of the fearing about possible invasion from Russia. So they coexist in a double level, that is to develop a national identity and autonomy, at the same time also to respect what are the acquis, the standard, economic standard, just to join also the euro area. So in many cases they are doing very well, I mean, in terms of economic growth. Skype.
I'm glad you brought up the expansion point because Professor Carloni brought it up as well. I haven't thought much about enlargement, but what struck me from the beginning was that, you know, why would they? I understand why states would want to get into the union, right? They're poor, they can get a big market, right? The Poles can send their plumbers to France, right? Which is a huge scandal in Europe, by the way. If any of you don't have a job after graduation, you should get into plumbing and go to France. So that's pretty easy to explain. But your question was about, you know, the reaction of the ins, right, as the outs came in. And I couldn't understand why they let them in. And then it struck me that maybe the French and the Germans realized that the writing's basically on the wall, right? Because as you're letting more people in, the chances that you're going to come to any decisions are going down, right? You got more and more opinions, right? More and more people bothering you, sort of voting against your proposals, et cetera, et cetera. So why not let them in? And I think they let them in because they realized that, you know, that you're going to enlarge it, but as you enlarge it, it's going to get shallower, right? That you're going to move away from a union towards more of a sort of intergovernmental organization. And as you pointed out, as these countries came in, they did start causing headaches, right? And I don't think the French were happy with the Poles. I don't think the Germans are very happy. You know, I think they're happier with them than they are with Spain, right, which is going to bring this whole thing crumbling down. But yeah, I mean, I think it caused problems. But again, I think it was a tacit admission that this thing is done as a union. Again, plenty of intergovernmental cooperation, but that can happen with people with different views. But with all these disparate views, the union's not going to function, and I think they knew that.
You had a student here? Yes.
There was also
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Professor Rosado's home country initially refused entry into the European coal and steel community, declined its invitation.
You bet we
And
did.
I'm wondering if your theory explains that, and I guess I'll also ask for Professor Coloni's
Sorry,
opinion.
I didn't get.
Why did the UK not?
Okay.
It's always been a pretty reluctant
Okay,
partner.
we
but
know.
why?
I was saying. Whoa.
I'm sorry.
Sebastian had to get out his book and look it up.
That's what's going to happen to the European Union. The lights are going to go out. Well, I don't want to talk too much about my book because I want you to buy it. And Mike, I'd be happy to sign it for you. And I also don't want to bore people with IR theory. But my basic argument in the book is that this is all about France and Germany, and that Britain is reluctant. And again, all states are reluctant to give up sovereignty. But France and Germany have no choice because they live next door to the Soviet Union. And the Red Army is going to come rolling across Europe, and no one's going to be able to stop them. By the way, the U.S. war plan for when the Soviets start coming is they're going to run for the beaches, right? And that is the war plan. They're going to run for the beaches, and they're going to head to Britain, right? And then they're going to use Britain as a giant aircraft carrier to launch their attack back into Europe, right? So they have to do it, right? Because they're right next to the Soviets, and they're going to be the first targets. The British are kind of off the continent, right? They got the English Channel, never been invaded since 1066, right? Didn't get invaded by Hitler, right? Survived World War II. And so again, not that they're not worried about the Soviets, and they're perfectly prepared to cooperate with the Europeans on all sorts of issues, but they're not going to give up sovereignty. You know, let the French and the Germans give up sovereignty and create the nucleus of this economic union to deal with the Soviets. We'll just sit there, and this is what Britain has done throughout its history, and by the way, is what the United States does today.
But we were also founder as Italians, and we are very close also to the former Yugoslavia. So, I mean, it's not only the axis, as I tried to say before, about Germany and France, but was also the problem of the Mediterranean, where we had also military bases in Naples, Trieste, very close to the former Yugoslavia. But what I want to say is that, okay, the United Kingdom joined the what at the time European Community in 1973, but you have not to forget that at that time he was the only real empire because it had still a lot of colonies, and it in such a way it has always a very skeptical also relation toward Europe. In fact, it does not belong to the Schengen Treaty. It does not, they have still pounds, they don't have the euro. So, I mean, but when there is a matter of power, they are very lobbyist. They put their representative, like in the case of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, who is a woman, a British woman. So, I mean, the United Kingdom has always had this thing to control and to be in power when necessary, but then in the second term, in 1973, with Denmark, Ireland, they joined the European Union, and now it depends, but they are no longer at least an empire.
So we have time for 2 more questions, and I'm going to call for the student back here. There was somebody
And
back here.
Professor
And
Dash.
then Professor Dash. He's going to get his say.
Yeah, my question dealt with the normative aspects of the EU project. So you've mentioned, for instance, the law about common migration. And many people would point to this as being one of the successful aspects of the EU projects, commonly held values and norms. However, when we look at different aspects of the EU immigration, we still see illegal deportations of the Roma. When we look at newly accepted states, we see that a lot of people, as soon as they get in the club, we see problems with corruption and the rule of law, Bulgaria being a good example, Kosovo. Also, when we look at foreign policy, we see different divergence on what we would consider EU values, right? The French offering the Tunisians help in their demonstrations, the Germans rejecting NATO involvement in Libya. So to what extent do you guys believe that EU norms and values do exist? And if you do think they exist in a commonly held version, are they getting weaker or are they getting stronger?
No, this is a good question. It's because it is exactly the point, the problem of xenophobia in Europe, the problem of, homophobia, the problem of violation of human rights, again, the Roman and so on. But we are aware. It's the reason why we have a Charter of Fundamental Rights, and there is an institution called the Agency for Fundamental Rights of the European Union. I was for 3 years also deputy representative for Italy, and it was something also embarrassing also to see the reports and how Italy, as a nation state, was violating, these rights. That is, the violation of human rights are still at the national level, and the European Union is taking measures and so on, and said today, for instance, the European Court stated that is illegal, is not correct what Italy did in terms of illegal migration, because you know that in Italy there is the law about immigration, so that illegal workers, illegal migrants can be punished under the penal code, so criminal code, or sent back. And also another tribunal of human rights connected to the Conseil de l'Europe, which is nothing to do with the European Union, also dealt with the problem of a man from Tunisia who was sent back from Italy, and he was tortured in Tunisia. So also Italy has been also charged for this reason. What I'm saying is that now, precisely because there is this violation of human rights, we have to deal also with common policies, because the Roma people, the issue of the Roma people is not only an Italian people. The problem of migration is not only a matter of Mediterranean countries and so on. We have to be aware and just to try to make that really, because they are still a problem. And we know that violation of human rights are always at the national level due to borders, due to legislation. But we know, and we are trying also to deal with these problems. Also, relation to now, the bombardment over Libya, and now also we have a lot of complications in the government, because Italy will be part of the bombardment, but Berlusconi, you know that he kissed the ring of Gaddafi, and because Italy also paid money to Libya to have in jail people coming from Central Africa. So it's a huge problem, but we have to be aware, and alone I think that we are not able just to face this global problem. So we need to be unified.
Bobby, did you use the term common culture? What exactly did you say?
Common values.
Okay, common values. I think there are a lot of common values on paper. They can produce common values like you wouldn't believe. Pages and pages of common values. The question is, do they actually, act based on common values? And I'm not going to repeat myself, so I'm going to give some different examples. You mentioned illegal deportations, right? As soon as the common value comes in contact with national interest, the common value is gone, right? There's this standoff right now between France and Italy. I haven't even read about it, but I sort of saw it out of the corner of my eye about some refugees, and they've been stopped at Ventimiglia, and the French won't let them in. Again.
Seeker. No, asylum seeker.
Yes, asylum seekers.
It was given as a humanitarian permission.
Eventually, but
No, it was given.
yeah, but they stopped the train. They stopped the train, and then they were told that they couldn't do it. But these are sort of. And I don't mean to denigrate them. These are sort of lower level issues. The violations of this common culture are at even higher levels. The single market, right? One of the fundamental aspects of the single market is that you can't aid firms from your own state because it won't allow a single market to occur. And the French launched a investigation of their own performance. And in the French parliament, the guy running the investigation says, France is the bad boy of Europe. Right? They're just breaking the rules left, right, and center. And what he didn't realize is the Germans are even worse, right? They give more state aid, they get twice as much state aid to their companies as the French do, right? And then don't get me started on the Growth and Stability Pact, right, which they violated every year from 2002 to 2005, right? And then when they had this big meeting and they're like, well, what are we going to do about the Growth and Stability Pact? They killed it. right? The French and the Germans eviscerated it. Again, it's all very well being European, but when the national interest is affected, there's no Europe.
Create something similar in Southeast Asia, and it didn't really go anywhere. And some people argue that there are currently sufficient common political and economic interests and shared culture in Northeast Asia to justify the creation of such an organization, but it hasn't materialized yet.
Start with Sebastian on this.
No, none unless the Soviet Union comes back. The interesting thing about the American attempts in Southeast Asia, when the Americans were great supporters of European Union, again, because they wanted to get out of town, right? I said at the beginning they're unreliable. They wanted to get out of town. They're big supporters of the European Union, and they thought long and hard about pushing an Asian Union. But the problem was it was going to be Japan and no one else, right? You can't have a union with only one state. And they just didn't think it would be powerful enough, even if it came together, to be able to deal with the Soviets, so it never happened. You say there are common values and common interests in Asia today, and they could create a union. I bet you they'll create some kind of institution, but it ain't going to be a union unless China comes knocking. Then who knows?
What I think is that couldn't be the same experiment, in other places, because it was established in a particular context, geopolitical context that is related to post-war, so with the Shoah, with genocides, and also with the problem to find peace and economic growth in Europe. I think that in the new age of globalization, we can find new forms of cooperation. Also in Europe, we have a cross towards east, really cross region, the form of macro regions through the borders, also because of migrants or because of trade and so on. So I think that also in Asia and Africa, mainly in Africa, because there is a huge problem where we have still ethnical war, to find new forms of cooperation. But I think that each part, they could find their own language also because of the change of mobility, globalization, different forms of states and tradition. But I would encourage, mainly in Africa, forms of cooperation and development.
Thank you.
Excuse me, sir, would you wait for the microphone? We have some people in another room that need to hear this.
Also for the registration.
Tomorrow at his Nanovic Institute board meeting, Jim's going to announce a 10,000 euro prize, the Nanovic Prize for perspicacity in European politics.
And we've already decided.
I'm the judge of it, and we have to figure out which of the two of you we're going to give this 10,000 euros to. So I've come up with a way of sort of deciding between the two of you. So I'm going to ask the same question to both of the panelists. What development within the next 10 years would lead you to concede to the other that he or she is right and ought to get a check for 10,000 euros from Jim McAdams?
Mike, I don't take money because it affects my intellectual honesty. So thanks for the offer. If the euro is still around 10 years from now, I'm wrong.
The value of the European Union does not have price. So. So it's in our future in our hands, and I think that we'll see something different. It's an ongoing experiment. Could stop, could change, but we'll never come back to the nation state. A Westphalian nation state, because we had wars. There is a wonderful also exchange of letters between Einstein and Freud regarding the First World War, and they said the World War I, and they said that precisely before the states, also in the Belle Époque, they are struggling, but outside Europe. Then with the World War I, they started to struggle also between them. Then we had the worst, the World War II. So I think that we'll never go back to the states we knew, because was also a violent state, and only just in different forms or overlapping forms of collaboration, development, we can find, so to say, well-being for all human beings, not only of the European Union, because I think that our task is also to create our identity, but not excluding the others. So this is and also the Americans, so you are welcome.
And now I'll give you an opportunity, Marina, to speak for no more than 3 minutes.
Yeah, okay. So, just very briefly, I would like to conclude with an Italian theorist, Antonio Gramsci, saying that we have to have the pessimism of reason and the optimism of the will. So, after this debate, I would like all participants to come to Europe, and mainly to students to come to Europe, and we are glad to welcome and to increase also a collaboration with the European, also with the US, and all people we have the same also aims, that is peace and prosperity. And I would like also to encourage mainly students to look at the website of the European Union, and also at the communication policy, because one of the main issues of the European Union is to have transparency. So it's europa.eu. It's declined in 23 languages and contain more than 4 million of official documents. And because we had, as European, a tragic past, we have also, at the same time, a common future. So I think that was also Sebastian said about there has been no meaningful political integration in Europe over the past 2 decades. Consider what's happened with 12 new countries, and also the next candidate countries, mainly belonging to the former Yugoslavia, is dubitable of this affirmation, and also because of the factualities, not only as the institution we have, not only because of the troubled unification process, but because of the concrete daily experience of ordinary citizens who belong to their country and at the same time to the European Union. So long life to the European Union, at least as a common space of liberty and fairness, which we want to share also with non-EU citizens. Thank you.
Marina.
I just quickly want to remind you of what I said. I think you need a theory, because we can all talk as much as we want about refugees and rules and things. You know, no one thought World War I was going to happen in 1913, and it happened the following year. And if you'd had a good realist theorist in 1913, he'd have told you it was coming. So we need theories, and I laid out a theory for you, and you got to decide whether you think it's a good theory or a bad theory, if it has evidence, if it has logic, though I would caution you that Ken Waltz says it's logically and historically impressive. But you got to work out what you think about the theory, and you got to then think about what you think of the other theories. And we've talked a lot about the cultural theory, I don't think the cultural theory, as I told you before, had a lot to do with the origins of this thing. I also don't think the cultural theory can explain why the EU is in such trouble today. I don't think anybody can deny that, you know, things are not great in Europe right now, right? This is not the 1990s when, as I was saying to Rita, everybody thought everything was going to be great. I mean, there's not a lot of feeling of common Europeanness. There's another argument out there which we'd never talked about in any great detail, which is the economic argument. And a lot of people argue that, you know, Europe is all about prosperity, right? It was created because these states were very economically interdependent and wanted to get rich. I would just say to you, there's no evidence for that theory either. Back in the day, they weren't interdependent at all. Today, they are very interdependent, and they're fighting tooth and nail. So that theory doesn't make a lot of sense. So you got to decide what theory you think is right, and then you got to draw logical conclusions from that theory. And that's what I tried to do today. I could be wrong, but I think I have the best chances of being right because I came up with a theory, and I don't think the other arguments stand up to scrutiny. And again, I'm not saying there's not going to be cooperation in Europe. There will be. I just saw the 60-second sign, so I will just say one last thing. As I said at the beginning, I'd like to express my gratitude to the Nanovic Institute. And I know they're having a board meeting this weekend, and probably one of the things they're going to be interested in is how they're going to grow the endowment. And I want to say to them, take all your money and short the euro. And I'll only charge 5%.
Now we have one last portion of this debate, which is to pose a question that I'll have you vote on. But I don't want this to be a question about the individuals on the panel, partly because Sebastian has already paid off his students. And then also, since Sebastian has compared himself to George Bush, and I'm beginning to see the similarities in his reasoning, and I think that Marina would benefit from being Al Gore. So the question is this, for a show of hands, do you think the EU will go away or stay? So first of all, do you think the EU will go? Okay. And then, do you think the EU will stay? It's a draw. Remarkable. I was worried about having to pay Professor Dash somehow this reward. So thank you very much for joining us today, and let's thank our panelists again.